Good afternoon, Biology 1 students. I know that you missed Miss Pipe, so we've been apart for the last couple days, and I had to make sure that I touch base with you to make sure that you're tracking with me as it relates to your unit on ecology. Some of you have already been reaching out to me via email and by phone. Those of you who feel like you need additional support, you have a way to contact me if need be by email at teacuptimes@gmail.com, which is our Google Classroom email, or you can reach me through my GCS email, which is pipert@gcsnc.com. And if need be, you can reach out to me by phone at 708-200-9290. So just wanted to make sure that you were able to track with me as it relates to what you're supposed to understand from your Learn Ed book, that assignment that I gave you on Friday before the storm hit us. And so just want to make sure that you and I are on the same page as to what you are supposed to know. So let's just go ahead and start. I'm trying not to hold you for very long. Over the next couple of days, there'll be some short video snippets explaining our unit. And then when we come back together, we'll make sure that we're all on the same page again, moving us forward in preparation for our EOC, which is coming up very fast, ladies and gentlemen. So just so you know, we are under the we're under the guns now. We got to really push forward and do what we need to do. So here we go. Ecology. Ecology is just simply the study of the interaction between biotic and abiotic factors. And when we reference biotic factors, we're talking about living things. We're talking about things that express the characteristics of life. So we're talking about things that contain DNA. We're talking about things that have the ability to reproduce. We're talking about those things that have the ability to experience gas exchange. We're talking about those things that are composed of cells that we've been talking about over the last months. And so when we're talking about living things, we're talking about in an ecosystem, we're talking about producers and consumers. We're talking about plants and animals, essentially. And then when we move to an abiotic factor, we're talking about those things that are non-living, those things that are in a given environment that surrounds living things, that have a direct impact or influence on how living things actually survive or live. So an ecologist is a scientist who studies the interaction between non-living and living things. Their focus is to see how the interdependence or how non-living and living things work together in a given environment. So that's what an ecologist does. And there's some things that an ecologist needs to know about and be aware of as he's looking at the interaction between non-living things and living things, or what we call abiotic factors and biotic factors. So the very first thing that an ecologist is going to look at in these interactions is going to be what we call an individual. And an individual is an organism or something that is living that we say is expressing the characteristics of life. So these organisms have DNA. They have, again, like I mentioned before, they have the ability to participate in gas exchange. They have the ability to interbreed, and they have the ability to produce offspring. So an individual is basically a living organism that exists in an environment. And then individuals move from being one to a group. And typically, when we're talking about an individual moving from being one to a group, we call that a population. And a population is going to be a group of individuals, organisms that are expressing characteristics of life that share similar characteristics. And when we're talking about similar characteristics, we're talking about similar DNA. They have similar nitrogenous sequences for the sequences for their nitrogenous bases. They're going to interbreed and they're going to produce offspring amongst one another. And so we call that a population. Like humans, we are a population. We share similar genetic sequences or nitrogenous sequences. We interbreed and we produce offspring. So we're a population. So basically, we move from an individual to a population to a community. And so a community is going to be where you have a few populations that are existing in an area and they're interacting in the same environment. They're sharing the resources in that environment and they're interacting with one another as well for the purposes of survival. And so then we move on to an ecosystem, which is essentially a large community where you have several populations and networks of populations that are interacting in a given area. They're sharing similar resources. They're depending on one another for survival. This is when you start to get into those predator-prey relationships. This is where you start to get into mutualism, parasitism, commensalism, which we'll talk about in class, and how organisms interact within an ecosystem, or populations interact with one another within a given ecosystem. So basically, an ecosystem is going to be basically those variety of communities within a given area that are interacting and that are interdependent. They're working together for the purposes of survival. But then we have these large and broad systems that take up a great amount of space on a given area on the planet, and we call those biomes. These are essentially large ecosystems that have multiple ecosystems in a given area, and the same thing is happening. They have populations there that are interacting with one another. They're interdependent. They depend on each other for survival, but it's multiple communities that are living in one given area, and they take up a fair amount of space on Earth, and we call those biomes, like tropical rainforests, like savannas, like the tundra, deciduous forests. Those are all examples of what we call biomes. So when we talk about the components of an ecosystem, you should keep in mind that ecosystems start with an individual. An individual is usually a living organism that possesses the characteristics of life. It has DNA. It has the ability to produce offspring, and it has the ability for gas exchange, just like in photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So when we think about plants, we think about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. My class should know that. And as well as when we think about animals, we're thinking about cellular respiration. So we're thinking about that exchange, or that cycle of exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen within amongst organisms. So when we think about that, there's one other thing that you need to be mindful of when an ecologist looks at a system. They're also looking at energy transfer. So that pyramid that you saw in your Learn Ed book is essentially about how energy is transferred from one organism to another. And typically, I will share with my students that this is according to the laws of thermodynamics. So basically, the laws of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed, and also energy is transferred, which means it's either passed from one object to another, or it's passed from one organism to another. But when we look at the energy pyramid in ecology, we're looking at energy being passed from one organism to another. And so when we talk about energy transfer, we start with producers. We're starting with those organisms that have the ability to make their own food, and then they also produce that food for other organisms. So when we think about producers, we should always be thinking about plants. We're thinking about trees. We're thinking about bushes. We're thinking about grass. We're thinking about flowers. We're thinking about anything that is plant life. And essentially what those organisms do is they take radiated energy from the sun and convert it into energy, what we call chemical energy, called ATP. And we know that the process for doing that is photosynthesis. And so anything in an ecosystem that has the ability to go through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, which happens in the ocean, those organisms are making their own food, and they're doing it through energy transfer from the sun. And then not only do they make their own food, but they have the ability to pass that energy on to another organism, which makes them an actual producer. And so the organism that is taking in energy from plants or from other organisms is going to be called a consumer. So consumers are going to be us. They're going to be other animals. And so basically what we do is we take our energy either from plants or other small animals. That's what we do when we eat a piece of fried chicken. We're taking energy from a smaller animal is essentially what we do. And so in that energy pyramid, you start with producers, and most of the energy being at the bottom of the triangle with plants. And then that energy becomes less and less as it moves up the triangle. So of course it makes sense that we have more producers than we do tertiary consumers. So we move from producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers to tertiary consumers, and not on your pyramid is what we call quaternary producers. And so I mention that to my students because they need to know that for the future. And you know, I'm always thinking about your future. And so basically what you need to understand is producers pass the energy to primary consumers. Primary consumers pass the energy on to secondary consumers. Secondary consumers pass the energy on to tertiary consumers, and tertiary consumers pass the energy on to quaternary consumers. But most of the energy in that pyramid is going to lie with producers. The other thing that you need to know that ecologists would inform you on is the fact that producers are also considered autotrophs, which means they self-feed. We always talk about how plants make their own food, and the way that we describe it here in our class is the fact that we call them autotrophs. They have the ability to get energy from themselves. They self-feed. They make their own food. And then consumers are going to be called heterotrophs. So anything that is a primary consumer all the way through quaternary consumers is going to be called a heterotroph. And heterotrophs get their energy from other sources. Hetero means other and troph means feed. So consumers feed from other sources. They get their energy from somewhere else other than themselves. So we call them heterotrophs. So with that being said, we'll talk about later tomorrow about the different types of heterotrophs. When we talk about carnivores, omnivores, we'll be talking about that in our next video. But for now, just be mindful of the components of an ecosystem, what ecology actually is, and prepare yourself for the connection between the environment and its effect on a species or group of individuals that will ultimately lead to our understanding of evolution. See you next time.